This is the fourth sign in John. Remember, we've talked about the different signs that he turned the water into wine. He healed the royal official's son. He healed the man who had been lame for 38 years. And so today we come to the fourth sign. So stand with me. Let's read this together. John chapter 6, 1 through 15. A lot of stuff to dive into today. Thank you for coming. Thank you folks that are watching. We love you. We appreciate you. After this, Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias. By the time John wrote this, they had changed the name to Tiberias after Tiberius Caesar. But back when Jesus was active, they called it the Sea of Galilee. So that's why we have that there. A huge crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was performing by healing the sick. Jesus went up on a mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, a Jewish festival, was near. So when Jesus looked up and noticed a huge crowd coming toward him, he asked Philip, "Where will we buy bread for all these, so that all these people can eat?" And he asked him this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough for each of them to have a little. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" And Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, so they sat down. The men numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, and after giving thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also with the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were full, he told his disciples, "Collect the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces from the 5 barley loaves that were left over for those who had eaten. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This truly is the prophet who is to come into the world." Therefore, when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. God's people said, Amen. Please be seated. So, a lot happening here. 5,000 men had come to hear him, to see him perform. Many of them probably had ailments that they wanted him to heal them from. And so they're just pressing in. Now he tells us that it's near the Passover. So what he's saying is that it's spring. That tells us that. There's grass. But it tells us another thing too. Now he had gone across the Sea of Galilee over on the other side over here. This happened in what we call the Golan Heights. You've probably heard them talk about the Golan Heights in the news, even to this very day. The Golan Heights is also where the 7 days war, the Six-Day War took place back in the 60s when Israel had a great victory there. And so this is where they are. Well, that's the route that people would take from Galilee to filter down and go into Jerusalem for the Passover. That may be why there was such a large crowd, is that there was a lot of pilgrims heading toward Jerusalem that were coming through there. And of course they hear about Jesus. The word of mouth just spreads about the things that he's doing. That's what John tells us here. And so they want in on it. They want to hear him. They want to see him. They want to see him perform. Maybe he's got a miracle for them. And so they're pressing in on him. He sees all of this coming, and he says to Philip, he says, we remember when we went through the disciples and we talked about how Philip might have been a bit of a bean counter. He seems to be kind of a guy that keeps up with, here's what we need, here's what we have, that kind of a guy. And so he says, "Philip, let's feed all these people." It's interesting. This story, this account, is the only miracle that's in all 4 Gospels other than this one particular big miracle that is in all 4 Gospels. The resurrection. Yeah, the resurrection. All right. But this is the only other miracle that's in all 4 Gospel accounts. And some of the accounts say, Jesus said, "Do you feed them?" So he's testing them. He's saying, "What are we going to do?" And I love this attitude. This needs to be our attitude towards Jesus. What are you going to do? Mary comes up. We've run out of wine. What are you going to do? And so that needs to be our attitude toward Jesus. Well, here he kind of turns the tables. He said, what you going to do? What are you going to do? And Philip says, look, 6 months' wages, which is what 200 denarii would basically be. A denarius is a day's wage. A denarius is plural for that. So, he's saying, look, 200 days worth of day's pay would only give everybody just a bite. Just a little bit, just a bite. And Jesus says, have them sit down. And so so Andrew comes up. Now, remember what we talked about Andrew. This is Simon Peter's brother. All three stories that mention Andrew's name, he's bringing somebody to Jesus. Remember that? He brings Peter to Jesus. He brings this boy to Jesus. And then later he brings some Greeks to Jesus that wanted to talk to him. And so he's always bringing somebody to Jesus. Well, Andrew, finds this boy. I like this representation here. That's probably not too far off of the little barley loaves and the fish. It was his lunch, I heard a preacher say, it was the $3.95 special from. I messed up the joke because I can't remember the name. We used to have Long John Silver's. Yeah, that's what it was. It was the daily lunch. It was the daily lunch special from Long John Silver's. Basically, what he had. I messed the joke up, so sorry. But anyway, this would have been a typical lunch for somebody. His mama packed it, and he had his lunch. Now nobody else did, as far as we can tell. But he did, because Andrew went looking for food. It was like, hey, well, all the disciples did. Hey, y'all got food? Who's got food? Anybody bring anything? And nobody did. But this boy had this particular lunch, 5 loaves, 2 fish. And now what you going to do with, you've got 5,000 men. Now all 4 accounts emphasize that was just the men. That's the way they counted back then, is basically heads of families. In other words, basically they're saying there's 5,000 families is basically what they're saying. This is 15,000 people. I know we've discussed this before, or 20, 10, somewhere. There's a lot of people. But all 4 accounts say 5,000. And so 5,000 men. So there's a ton of people. Well, how are you going to feed 5,000 men? How are you going to feed 15,000 people with this? It's impossible. But that's what this is all about, is that God can do the impossible. That's why we're here worshiping Him, celebrating Him. We know that He can do the impossible. There's things that just absolutely do not seem possible. There's no way God can fix this. But we still need to come to Jesus with the attitude of, what are you going to do? Because He can do the supernatural. And if we don't see anything else today of all the stuff I'm going to go over, I want us to see, and I want us to realize, and I want us to remember that our God is supernatural. He supernaturally created everything. Einstein is credited, I don't know if he said it or not, but he's credited with saying either everything is a miracle or nothing is. Now, whether he said that or not, it's true. Everything is a miracle. Our life, the air in our lungs, it's a miracle. And here, Jesus is showing His miraculous power. He's got this to work with. And of course, the other thing that we've got to see, that if we'll just bring Him what we have, let Him work with that. And He can do stuff that I just never imagined that He could do. Let me just brag on our church for a minute. There's not very many of us today, right? So we're a pretty small church. We got a lot of room to grow. If any folks are watching, we got plenty of room for you. You don't have to sit near anybody. You can sit all by yourself. Nobody's going to elbow you or bother you if you want to come in. But yet, I posted a picture on Facebook this week of our friend Praymod and his new motorcycle that this church purchased. And, if we're small and we're on the other side of the world, but yet God can use us. It's just remarkable. And that, to me, that's just such a good example of how we might look small and weak, but God can use us to feed a multitude, or to minister somewhere that none of us will ever even visit. He is supernatural. His power is supernatural. And I want to talk about this miracle itself and just kind of emphasize some thoughts on it. The first signs in John are mostly private. I mean, it's a wedding, but it's only the wedding party that gets to enjoy the wine. It's fairly contained. It's fairly private. And then when the royal official comes up to Jesus and asks for him to heal his son, and then that's just kind of a private thing between him and this royal official. And of course, other people saw this, and the servants came out and told him. So there were some other people. It was mostly private. And then when he walks up, he steps over people. He walks up to the man at the pool there at Bethsaida that we talked about last week and heals him. It's kind of a private thing. And we even discussed the fact, why didn't Jesus just say, okay, you're all healed, go home? Because he deals with this individually. He may have a reason for why we have the infirmity that we're dealing with. And so he deals with this on an individual basis, but it's almost as though John is saying, oh, and by the way, he can say, okay, I'm going to take care of a huge crowd all at once. And so that's one thing about this, is it's not just him healing some person. It's not just him changing water to wine. It's him feeding a multitude of people all at the same time. And they all saw this miracle. And, I like the way The Chosen depicted this. You wonder, he took this little lunch, he blessed it, and of course that's key. I mean, with his blessing, small things can be a huge blessing, right? So we need Jesus' blessing on our resources. He's the source, we're the resource. We let him bless it, he can turn it into something fantastic. And so even if we have a small amount of something, let him bless it. So he blesses it, he gives thanks to the Father, and then it would take forever for him to just start. How did he do this? The disciples looked into their baskets and, did he put a little here? How did he do this? Somehow all of a sudden there's just all these loaves and all these fish, and we're left to our imagination of how they passed all this out. Did he hand a little to the disciple? And then as the disciple starts to hand it out, it's like, I just handed this and it's not going away. But somehow they fed 15,000 people handing this out. And so, did they do the Baptist thing where they come by the table and come by the line, No, it says that he handed it out. So he's handing out all this food. And this miracle, he's not restoring. This is not a restorative. This is just a total creation. And this reminds us of Genesis 1, where God spoke everything into existence. And also John 1 reminds us that nothing was created that Jesus didn't create. And that bread didn't come from the barley that was grown. This just came straight from heaven. It just came straight from God. This barley wasn't even under the curse, of growth. And so those fish had never swam in the sea. He just zapped them into existence. He just willed it. He just wanted it to be. And you have all these fish that just suddenly appear, enough to feed all of those people. Now, when they collected the basketfuls of leftovers, notice that they only collected the bread. You don't want to collect fish. And you don't want to have basketfuls of fish. That could be kind of a smelly mess after about one day, right? And so notice they ate the fish, but they collected the bread pieces that were left over. And so, the fact that they had all this left over reminds us that He's a God of more than enough. He didn't just give them enough. They all ate as much as they wanted and still had leftovers. And so it's just a wonderful reminder that our God is a God of more than enough. And He created this. He didn't change something. He didn't restore or heal something. He just made it. He just made it happen. And so I love this about this. The food just came from nowhere. And we give Him what we have, and He can turn that into greatness. He can turn that into a great ministry. He can minister to people that we never thought we could possibly minister to. Maybe someone that we never even met, He can minister to. And so let's give Him what we have. Let Him bless it. And then He can turn it into more than enough. He's a God of more than enough. And so I love that. Well, let's go just a little bit deeper with this. Because there's a couple of things that I want us to see as part of what John is up to here. Because John's building a case. He's only showing us certain signs. He told us right here that they wanted to see the signs that He was doing. He was healing the sick. He tells us right here, and He's told us before, He's doing other things that I, John, am not including in my outline. But what I'm doing is building a case to prove that He's the Messiah. And I'm building a case to prove that He's superior to the Old Testament prophets. He's the fulfillment of the Old Testament. The Old Testament, Paul says, was like our babysitter until Jesus came along. And Jesus is the fulfillment of all those prophecies. 350 prophecies, 613 laws. He's superior to this. And John is showing us how Jesus is superior to Moses specifically, and superior to the Old Testament and to the law, and how what Jesus is doing is a fulfillment of that, but that He's superior to that. And we get that from Hebrews chapter 1 as well. And I was thinking about how these signs that we're looking at in John have a counterpart in the Old Testament, and He's superior. Jesus' miracle is superior to what we saw there. Jesus' first miracle was that He turned water into wine. And of course, back in the Old Testament, Moses turned water into blood. This is part of the plagues that we find from the Old Testament. Moses took the life of Pharaoh's son. Actually, God did. Took the life of Pharaoh's son in the Passover because he didn't have the blood of the post, the blood of the lamb on the post. Jesus heals a royal official's son. So you see there's kind of an Old Testament counterpart. Moses provided water from a rock. Remember that? Jesus offered the woman at the well living water and told her that she would never thirst again if she would drink of the water that He offered. Moses gave the law, including the Sabbath day law. By the time Jesus had come along, we talked about this last Sunday, the Jews had pretty much ruined the law, the Sabbath day law. They had doubled the amount of laws from the Old Testament just for the Sabbath. And Jesus walked up, heals a man on the Sabbath to show that He is Lord of the Sabbath and that He is greater than the Sabbath. And that what we find is that in fact He is our Sabbath rest. He is our Sabbath. And so just showing that superiority, the Old Testament was important and it was good, but Jesus is superior. So John is showing, look, he's the Messiah. And he's even superior to our religion that we all grew up with, our faith, our Jewish faith. Jesus is superior. Moses gave manna each day to the people. Jesus fed 5,000 people this day. Now, if we keep reading into John chapter 6, what we find is that the next day, of course, that evening, Jesus went up to pray. We know what happens that evening from Matthew 14 and the other accounts, and also here. And then Jesus comes walking out on the water. That's our next miracle. It's our next sign. It's him walking on the water. And so the people find Jesus. I think it's back at Capernaum the next day. And so they came up and said, yeah, it was. And so they said, so when did you get here? And so he talks to them, and they said, we love this feeding thing. You know, they said, Moses fed the people every day. Why don't you feed us like this every day? And Jesus said, you remember what he said? He said, I am the bread of life. Well, that takes us to the first of the I ams. And so this chapter, this is the longest chapter in John, by the way, John chapter 6. And it gives us both the fourth sign and the first I am. Because he said, I am the bread of life. And then he has this discourse with them where he's saying, it wasn't Moses that gave y'all, your ancestors, manna. It was God. And I am God. I am the bread of life. So come to me. And remember what he said? He said, eat my flesh. Now we know that this is just symbolic when he says this. And you'll never be hungry again. I will satisfy your needs. I will take care of you. Trust me. Completely trust me. And I will feed you. I will take care of you. I'm the source. I have resources. But I think John is showing us that Jesus is superior to that, because here Jesus reminds them that it was God that provided the manna in the wilderness, not Moses. And so him feeding all these people that day is a sign that he is superior to Moses, that he is God, that he's the one that can create food and give it to them. By the way, Matthew 14 has a feeding of 5,000. Matthew 15 has a separate feeding. It's the feeding of 4,000, and it's a completely different story. And so apparently Jesus did this more than once. We have at least 2 accounts recorded in the Scripture where Jesus did. And so Jesus is superior to Moses because he gave manna every day, and Jesus is the bread of life. And this also shows us that Jesus was superior to Elijah, who is considered the greatest of the prophets. Well, Isaiah, Elijah, these are the greatest of the prophets. And Elijah fed 100 men with 20 barley loaves. I don't know if y'all knew that story or not in the Scriptures. Can I write it down? It's 2 Kings chapter 4. Elijah feeds 100 men with 20 barley loaves. And so Jesus is showing that he is superior to Elijah because he fed 15,000 with 5 loaves, 2 fish here. And I was thinking about as we move forward, the next miracle that I plan to be out next week, but the next week when I come back is him walking on the water. And so you're not going to want to miss that. Well, Moses parted the water and they walked through. Jesus walks on top of the water. So you see, just everything from the Old Testament, Jesus comes and does it better. And I think this is one of the things that John is showing us, is that he's superior to the Old Testament prophets. He's superior to the law. He's superior to everything else. He is the Messiah, and these are the signs. And then we're going to come to the man born blind. And we find in Deuteronomy 28, the Lord will afflict you with madness, blindness, and confusion of mind. He's talking about, I'm going to curse you if you break the law. This is Deuteronomy 28. And so by healing the man born blind, Jesus showed that he has overcome the curse of the blindness, of the law, the curse of the law. You remember the disciples. We'll get to this. The disciples said, why was this man born blind? Who sinned? Because they just knew. Somebody had to sin, they thought. Somebody had to sin for him to be born blind. Jesus said, nobody. Nobody. He was born this way to glorify me. And then of course he heals him. We'll talk about that later. And so Jesus is overcoming that. And then the final sign is the raising of Lazarus. And there's 3 times in the Old Testament when the dead came back to life. Elijah raised the widow's son. And then Elisha raised the Shunammite son. And then after Elisha died, they threw a dead guy in his tomb on his bones, and the guy came back to life. So those are the 3 guys in the Old Testament that came back to life. And Jesus is going to call Lazarus out of the grave. And so Jesus is showing that anything that happened in the Old Testament, he can do better. He's got more power. He's the Messiah. That's where the power actually came from, is from him. And so John is building this case by showing us these signs. Some are private, some are at a party, some having to do with a royal official, some are on the Sabbath day, some he's feeding a huge multitude of people all at the same time. Jesus is the master of quantity. When he changed the water into wine, we said he's the master of quality. He's the best wine anybody ever had, and don't you know it was? And then when he healed the royal official's son from a distance, we saw that he's the master of distance. Distance doesn't slow him down or stop him or bother him. Third, he's the master of time, because the man had been laying by the pool for 38 years, or had at least been paralyzed for 38 years, and Jesus healed him. And then today we come to, he's the master of quantity. He can take a small amount, bless it, and multiply it, and be a blessing to a tremendous amount of people. Let's give him what we got. Let's give it all to him. You know, he went all in for us. He gave it all. He surrendered in Gethsemane. He let them crucify him. He let them take his life from him. Of course, he gave his life. You don't take God's life. He gives it. He gave his life for us. He gave his all. Let's give him what we got. And you say, well, little old me, I'm too young, or I'm too old, or I'm too this, or I'm too... No. He can use us where we are. If we still got breath in our lungs, he can use us. We can pray for someone. We can be a blessing to someone. We can just be obedient. Just be obedient. Give yourself to God. And he can take the smallest amount and multiply it for good. Okay? If you will, and if you can, stand with me this morning for our closing prayer. Father, so good just to be reminded of how you can take such a small amount and bless it, turn it into such a blessing for so many. I think that you can use our church in that same way. That we're a small church, and you can take us and bless people that maybe we just don't even realize how you can use